Welcome to Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 6, we'll be talking with Nicole Tung about navigating ethical dilemmas. Nicole is a freelance photojournalist born in Hong Kong. She graduated from New York University in 2009 and freelances for international publications and NGOs, primarily covering the Middle East region. Her work often explores those most affected by conflict and the consequences of war. After covering the conflicts in Libya and Syria extensively from 2011, she has recently turned her focus to the protests in her native Hong Kong while documenting the aftermath of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Her work has been exhibited at various festivals worldwide and has received multiple awards, including an honorable mention for the IWMF 2017 Anya Niedringhaus Award and the 2018 Online News Association's James Foley Award for Conflict Reporting, among others. She's the 2020 recipient of the Visa pour l'Image French Ministry of Culture's production grant and is part of the Seven Foundation's Imagine Reflections on Peace exhibition and book. Nicole served on the board of the Frontline Freelance Register, advocating for the safety of freelance journalists around the world. She's based in Istanbul, Turkey. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I'm a photographer working in mainly the Middle East region, but also I've been covering Ukraine for the past 2 years. So a lot of what I cover is conflict and conflict-related stories.
Absolutely. And I think that, of course, there's a lot of ethical considerations that go into telling stories in conflict contexts. I guess I'd like to start with sort of understanding, how did you come to this and how did you begin to negotiate a space for yourself in telling conflict stories?
I think I never really was intending on documenting strictly conflict. I think it just happened that way, especially in the sense that when I was just starting out, the Egyptian revolution happened, and then, before that was Tunisia, and then it was Libya after that, and so on and so on. So it just happened to be at the time where I was starting out in my photography journey and career, and also was wanting to do work internationally. The Middle East region was always an area that I wanted to focus on because of my interest in its history and its culture. And as far as carving a space out for myself, I think I'm still doing that because there are so many photographers who cover these regions and conflicts. But trying to find deeper stories came probably after my first year spent in Libya doing a lot of frontline photos.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What does deeper storytelling look like for you, but specifically as well in contexts where there is an active conflict?
I think when I first started out, it was just trying to understand what I had to do in those circumstances. Libya was very fast moving. Everything was in flux all the time. It was very dangerous. And because I was so green, I really was just trying to figure out what the story was, and it was a very general story. But then I think more in Syria the year after, in 2012, it was seeing that the news coming out of Syria was not really always making the impact that I think a lot of journalists were hoping that it would have at that time. So it was then a kind of shift to try and, look for things that were a bit more nuanced. So I would spend, a week or so in one specific hospital. I had the permission from one of the doctors himself, who was just he was still a doctorate student at the time the revolution broke out, but then very quickly rose to become one of the leading frontline doctors, triage doctors. And with his permission and blessing, obviously, my colleague James and I were able to spend a week in that hospital just trying to get a sense of what the doctors' lives were like, but also looking at the people who were coming in. Often they were civilians, more often than not, they were civilians. And then sometimes they were fighters. And we were just trying to piece together what the impact was on the civilian population itself. And then I did a series on nighttime in Aleppo, which was going dark because of the war. The electricity was going out. Sometime around 2013, something like 75 or 80% of the lights had gone out over Syria. And I was just, because I could only really access one city, I wanted to look at what that was doing to people's livelihoods and trying to look at a broader sense of this is what war does to, a place like Aleppo, which was Syria's second city. It was the most populous and industrious city before the war. So I was looking at how to do things other than just the front line, of which there was plenty in Aleppo. It was kind of in lots of different places that we could access. But I wasn't really sure what other stories I could tell from the front line. And I wasn't really in a place at that time, especially with assignments severely lacking, because a lot of publications didn't want to take the responsibility for freelancers. It was just a matter of trying to balance the risk and the deeper storytelling.
I think there's a lot in that already that we could dig into. I mean, you said something at sort of the start of that description about impact. And I'd like to know more, I guess, first about how do you see impact in your work, or how do you think about impact in your work? Because I know that I've spoken with some other photographers who say very much like their job is to take the pictures and the impact is something outside of that for them. I think other photographers are very invested in the impact. And how do you feel about all of that?
For me, I think it lands somewhere in between. I think my job isn't just solely to take pictures and then leave the scene and then it's kind of put to the back of my mind. There is a responsibility that comes with the privilege of being a photographer, photojournalist. And it's a case-by-case basis for me, to be honest. Like, every story that we do, I don't think we have the capacity to make the impact that we personally wish we could. But you have to pick and choose. Like, there are some stories where you might have the capacity to do something, but we also can't promise the people that we're interviewing or photographing, we can't promise them, that their lives or their situation may change for the better. And we can't guarantee something because that's unethical. But if there is, for example, maybe someone who is, desperately seeking medical attention, and if I know of a medical NGO that is able to help, that should just be a human responsibility to go, well, I can connect the two parties to at least try and help. And then, other stories where maybe, like, for example, I go back to Syria quite a lot, and sometimes the schools are in real need of just basic educational supplies or pens and stationery and things like that. And people have reached out to me after seeing an article saying or asking how they can help. And I will try and connect them with the person or a teacher or a headmaster who I have the contact to there, and see how that might be facilitated. So I try and facilitate, but unless there's someone really desperately in need of help who's in front of me who I can physically help, sometimes the issue or the problem is so immense that my role is to document it, to then try and get the attention of the people who really can enact some sort of impact to do something about it. So it lands somewhere in between for me.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of following on from that, a question would be about intervention. I know that that's a big, quite a traditional, I guess, question in journalism about intervention. And how have you negotiated that in the past? Can you give us maybe any examples?
There haven't been situations where I've had to directly intervene, but I will, or if I see somebody who might be in trouble, I don't think it's my place to try and make the situation worse, in the sense that my presence as a foreigner can actually exacerbate the problem by defending somebody. Instead, if I were in that situation, I might try and take the person or people who are, vulnerable out of that situation if I can. But again, like it all kind of has to be weighed up, because ultimately I am there also to document. It's such a judgment call, and in the heat of the moment, because sometimes even if you do something, it might not change the outcome. So I think it's a very tricky situation. But again, I have to emphasize that, my role is, I am a person, I am a human, but I also have a job and role to document what's going on in front of me. And there's often other people around me who are more knowledgeable about the local customs, language, and things like that, who have a better sense or judgment of what should and shouldn't be done to intervene, as it were.
I think that's a really good point. And I think you sort of touched on something else that I think is really important, which has to do with understanding how your presence changes the situation. And I guess I'm thinking about maybe for people who are newer to the industry or trying to cultivate that kind of awareness. How did you do that? Or how did you begin to understand and the impact that you're having on a situation? How did you develop that self-awareness is really the question.
I think that it depends on the time you've spent with the people around you. If you've just walked into a situation, which, many of us do when we're covering any given story or a breaking news situation, it's different from maybe you spent a week with people or longer and you've established a level of trust that they, may not be as cognizant of you. So, however, I think that as a foreigner, no matter what, you're still going to potentially influence a situation, because people obviously are more aware of you. They're aware of like maybe how things come across or what they say. But, again, it's like I try, as much as anybody thinks they can be a fly on the wall, you're not going to be a fly on the wall when you are not from there or the community directly. So, I think it's when you understand that first and go into these places without thinking that you're one of the locals, which I think a lot of people might make the mistake of doing, and knowing that people will keep a certain distance from you for some time before they can really trust you, that is a key part to not just the things they share with you, but also the quality of the storytelling.
You mentioned as well about the specific challenges for freelancers or that freelancers face as well. And you mentioned that in terms of safety. I guess there's a lot we could go into about safety for freelancers. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I wonder if you could maybe speak to that a little bit about like the challenges of freelancing in the industry and maybe what you'd like to see change.
In the last, let's say, 12 years, there have been some really significant changes in the industry. It used to be that, well, at least the generation before me, the journalists who went to cover Bosnia and Somalia, for example, just went and did it. But I think in my generation, especially after the deaths of Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington in Libya, and then Marie Colvin in Syria, the freelancers, of which there became more of us, I think just decided that we needed to band together a little bit more and to be more united in the sense of for requesting kind of basic things that we needed to enable us to do the work we do, because more and more publications were hiring freelancers from 2011 onwards. So the Arab Spring, as we were calling it, kind of was a turning point, I would say, where publications were trying to readjust. They first decided not to work with freelancers, especially in Syria. And then as freelancers became a little bit more savvy, more and more media publications signed on to a document. It was kind of like a memorandum, essentially, between freelancers and the publications who signed on, that, each side or each party was responsible for having HEFAT training, and maybe publications would be more aware of the situation on the ground for the freelancers they were hiring, or providing insurance coverage and things like that. So that was in 2012, and since then there's been, the Rory Peck Trust. They'd always been supportive of freelancers, and then ACOS, A Culture of Safety, is kind of the umbrella group under which all of these smaller organizations fall under and try and coordinate. So it has improved since then. The media publications have tried to help subsidize HEFAT trainings in various parts of the world. And it has been much better. And I think freelancers are a lot more aware of the tools they need to break into this industry. But it's still prohibitively expensive because you might be able to get your HEFAT training subsidized, but it doesn't always mean that, the freelancer can afford the flights or the rest of the fees. And then on top of that is finding work in an even more competitive environment, So yeah, it's still very tricky, just in different ways than it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess as well, thinking about if you need any safety equipment, like I'm sure that's prohibitively expensive as well for a lot of freelancers, I would imagine.
Yeah. And, I think even now, the freelancers are still responsible for, especially if they want to go to an area of conflict, their PPE, which is like a flak jacket and helmet and first aid kit and things like that. And the bar to get into a lot of these trainings is to have experience. So, it's kind of like it's a little bit of a catch-22 sometimes. But yeah, I think that it's improved definitely in the last decade.
No, that's a very optimistic note. That's good to hear that it's improved in some ways.
But I also want to add, I think that, freelancers have to be responsible and serious enough to take their safety seriously and take the people who they work with, their safety into account as well. Unfortunately, because of how many freelancers are out there, there's always bound to be people who kind of don't really take these issues quite so seriously.
Could you maybe describe a little bit what safety preparation looks like for you, or what you would recommend to people?
I think if you're able to get some sort of first aid training, even if it's not a full hostile environment first aid training course, at least to try and do it sometimes through local Red Cross or Red Crescent. They may have, a 2-3 day sort of course for people, for civilians. It's better than nothing. And then as far as preparation goes, is just being very sensitive to the people who you might be working with and what they're suggesting as far as safety concerns, and taking all of that into account before making decisions. And then it's really just kind of having your equipment together before going off on an assignment. I think sometimes people rely too much on getting there and going, well, I can find all of that there, or I'll borrow from somebody. But I think the best way to do it is just to rely on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned something earlier about, a consideration for the people that you're working with and their safety as well. And I know that a lot of times safety concerns are very cultural and context specific. You might not necessarily know what the risks are for someone as well as they might know the risks themselves, I think, when you're going into a new situation. How do you negotiate that or navigate that in your work, thinking about risks for others?
I think it's just having some basic research down. Like if you're going anywhere and understanding a little bit about maybe there's different sects or communities that are divided, and in a polite way asking the person who might be translating or working with you as a producer, which, where they fall in terms of how comfortable they are going into certain places. And then you kind of figure it out from there and make compromises, or you may have to get somebody else to help you if you're going to, another side of the divide, as it were. So I think just having that basic sensitivity and knowledge is so key.
How do you do your research?
Just talking to maybe sometimes other journalists who've been there previously, especially if it's somewhere I've not been at before, and then just doing the reading as much as I can.
Yeah, I think that there's a real theme there, isn't there, of like sort of supporting each other, I guess, in terms of, you're talking about freelancers banding together, but also sharing knowledge with each other. It seems like sort of a shared sense of community within the industry can be really useful.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think freelancers and photographers especially are generally pretty good at sharing information with each other, especially when it comes to safety issues.
And I've asked you about a few of the sort of, I guess, prominent ethical themes that I think of when I think of photojournalism. But I wonder what kinds of themes in ethics do you think are most important for you or most important for the industry to be thinking about or talking about?
I think that, well, I mean, that's a really big question, but it's so...
Sorry.
So no, it's fine. I think it's so subjective for everybody. I think for me personally, it's that we care about the stories that we do. You might be sent on assignment and it's something that you're not always necessarily interested in, or it's not really in your kind of line of sight all the time. But I think that just trying to have a level of, especially doing work in areas of conflict, to have a level of empathy with and understanding really of what people's experiences are. Because sometimes I think it's very easy for photographers to look at people as not people, but objects to be photographed. And it's very upsetting to be in some situations where people are treated as such. And it also gives journalism and journalists a bad name. So I can sort of understand where sometimes the public comes from when they voice their frustration or anger. And, I think there are a lot of moral questions and ethical questions that I wrestle with, just as far as, well, I've covered this story or an area of conflict for so long, just like hundreds of other people have. Ukraine is one prime example. And has it really changed anything for people, for the normal people living there? Yes and no. And these are very big questions that one wrestles with and also tries to, I guess, come to terms with, in the sense that, are my pictures really changing anything or moving anything in a direction, no matter what direction? And understanding the constraints within which we work is really important as well, because I think, sometimes we tend to kind of overcompensate or like just, feel like we're too important and just we need to like humble ourselves, again, because as much as everybody loves and enjoys being applauded on a stage and being given awards for, the work they do, sometimes I feel like we have to recorrect our course and focus on what is important and who it is that we are serving. Journalism is a public service. And I think that, I wish the public would also be more encouraging of journalists sometimes to not expect news for free. On the other hand, I think sometimes, we're so kind of focused on like getting praise, that kind of attention, instead of the actual attention being on the subjects that we're supposed to care about. So yeah, that for me, I guess, has been more on my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a real important point there about, and it's something that's come up a few times on the podcast, but it's like knowing why we're doing the thing that we're doing. Because I think the awards and things are such a big motivator, or can be such a big motivator. And it can feel really good to get that recognition. But yeah, is that why we're doing what we're doing? Because I think that if it is why we're doing what we're doing, it also really shapes the type of stories that we tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I will browse other photographers' work or I get an email from someone asking if I could have a look at their work, and I'll usually take a look at their page of list of accomplishments, and if it's like every award under the sun they've gotten some mention for, it's a red flag to me, because I'm like, well, you've applied and paid, especially the entrance fees, sometimes $30, $50 for a very obscure award. And, you've got about 24 to 30 of them listed. It just rubs me the wrong way.
No, that makes that I can understand that. Definitely. How did you learn about ethics in photojournalism? Was it something that you did as you went? And what resources were particularly useful for you? Be that specific books or just other photographers?
Yeah, it's a really good question and an important one, because I think there is no ethical guideline, as it were, for journalists. There's like the Community to Protect Journalists suggestions kind of guidelines on how to maybe cover trauma or people who have witnessed trauma or survived trauma, and how to interview children, for example. But like an all-encompassing kind of guideline on how to treat people is so subjective, and it comes from a lot of the times the culture we're brought up in, our backgrounds. So you can't really create a guideline and say that it should fit everybody. It just doesn't work that way. The people who are in journalism and photography are as diverse as, the world. So I think so much of it comes down to the individual's moral compass and the examples that they learn from, who they learn from as well. So I think that if you're kind of watching a photographer work and you can see that they're very, or trying to be very respectful, even in a very heated situation, or, how they talk about a situation, etc. That's how I think young photographers learn. Because there are, many freelancers or photographers around the world, there's less of a, how do I say this? I think people used to get to know each other in one given, let's just take conflict as the kind of main theme here, as like people would go to one place and learn from each other that way. That's how young journalists learned from the older journalists. And in a way, that's kind of how I learned, but a lot of it I would put down to how I was brought up. I don't think there's always the time or space for young photographers to learn these things. And also sometimes manners are just not learned. You kind of have to it's a tricky one, and it comes from really the background. So I would say that it's really picking and choosing the people that you can see who have an empathetic eye or sensitivity towards a subject. And, maybe trying to learn from their example, if that's possible. Yeah, it's a tough one.
No, I think that's a good answer, definitely. Are there any projects that you have worked on that have been particularly complicated to navigate ethically, or any situations that have been particularly fraught? And how did you negotiate that or navigate that for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, like in Syria, for example, there was a prison that was full of these accused ISIS fighters. And as a journalist, I was given access into the prison to photograph people. And the issue of consent from a prisoner is one issue on that occasion. And the other was that they were all in one room. It was several hundred men in one room. And, it was impossible, obviously, to take a picture with everybody's faces disguised or whatnot. But also the prison guards were not trying to take pains to hide their faces either. So, there was an ethical dilemma there, and I don't always feel good about taking those pictures. But I think in that case, it was that, I think in the caption, at least, I tried to explain the circumstances of the visit and how the picture was taken, I believe. So that was like one instance. And another, more recently, I was doing a story in Ukraine about widows, and mostly women who had lost their husbands who were soldiers fighting in the war. And a lot of them, of course, were at various stages of their grief. And I wanted to meet them several times, not just a kind of one-off visit. So the first meeting would always be a very long conversation, interview, and just trying to get to know them. And of course, the story about how they met their husband and all of the things that have happened after his death are usually talked about then. And it's a very emotional, traumatic thing for them to retell, of course. And then often when we asked to return, they would say no. So that was really complicated because obviously you have to respect their wishes. But my colleague and I were trying to very gently explain, well, this is why we'd like to come back, and to try and have a bit of a deeper understanding of your day-to-day life now. And it was for so many different reasons not really working. And so ethically you can push a little bit, but you can't really, obviously you can't force people, so that was very tricky to navigate. Also, like asking the questions that help inform the story and trying to explain their experiences to an audience. Like, how do you do that without being insensitive? Like, some people are very open, and then some people, are not so open without specific questions being asked. So, you're kind of sitting there in this interview being like, I feel awful for asking you this question, but then you ask the question. So, I think that a lot of times, and this can happen for any particular subject, story, you have to just be very sensitive. And if people say, I don't want to answer that, then you just leave it as it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of those examples definitely, I think they're both very good examples of things that are very complicated. And especially, thinking about really consent, I guess, in both cases. What is one common myth about photojournalism that you would want to debunk?
I suppose one of the myths is that it's still, in a way, very glamorized as one of the more pursued or sought after, let's say, profession in this industry, because I guess photographers have this reputation of being very freewheeling and just sort of out there doing their thing, which is true and not true. And it's very far from glamorous, because I think that, especially for younger photographers just trying to break in, the psychological impact of the things that you may see, especially in covering, very traumatic stories, be they in, somewhere in the middle of the country, wherever that may be, or in a conflict zone, you're not taught how to process those things, and you're not taught how to deal with those things. And I think, it's very easy to become callous when you have witnessed those situations over and over again. So when I say that photojournalism is very far from glamorous, I think that's what I mean. I think on the surface it looks very bright and shiny and very cool. But I think that there are a lot of, just like every situation I walk into to photograph, there's a lot of ethical and moral dilemmas to wrestle with. Sometimes, you're maybe not on your best performance, or you're not having the greatest day, and you make an error or a misjudgment, or you're not nice to somebody, and that, like, it can really haunt you. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of times you just have to be so, like, self-aware, and also processing these kinds of what you see on a very regular basis.
Absolutely. And can I just follow on from that and ask, how do you face that? How do you take time out and maybe reflect on those things and create space for yourself to make sure that you're in a good place?
I think that, just like anybody in starting out or who are in their 20s, it's very, you can keep going and going and going and think that everything's fine for a while, but then it does hit you, and it hits people differently. I think that, generally speaking, I can say that it's important to stop once in a while to maybe go over the photos again, because you're not always processing what you see in the moment of taking pictures, and finding activities or ways to get outside of your own head, or thinking about where you're going or where you've been. And everybody has different ways of doing that. Like, for me, love going for hikes. That's one example, or trail running. Like that's kind of my way of, just getting away from it a little bit. But it might be different for somebody else.
Absolutely. The last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Photography ethics for me means, I think, the framework within which you yourself work as a photographer, how you navigate various situations and moral or ethical problems that will inevitably come up. I think that being very conscious of where you draw the line on, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do if you're confronted with a very problematic situation is something that I try to kind of think ahead of before I work on a story, for example. And that I think comes with experience. I don't think you can have that framework without spending the time doing this work. Like certainly in my first year or two of documenting conflict, I was still building that kind of scaffolding. And it is something that you start to layer onto over the years because you encounter different things and you see different situations, and you also learn from the people around you. So it's really about whether you can go home at the end of the day or the assignment that you're working on and feel that what you did was mostly okay. Because a lot of times, like, you won't feel good about doing something or asking a question. But sometimes you also understand that without forcing people into something or how do I say it, without being, 100% truthful with them about your intentions and things like that, can you go home and feel okay about like how you navigated doing that particular story or making those photos, and whether that can sit with you. It's not always going to be 100%, and that's kind of part and parcel of what we do, but you try and make it as much as possible 100%.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Ariane Musleh on storytelling on social media. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.